All right, welcome back. Let's continue with our live coverage here on the SABC. Thank you very much for making us your channel of choice. Live visuals on your screens right now. You can see crowds slowly trickling in. This, of course, is ahead of the solemn requiem mass. It's set to take place at around 10 a.m. this morning for the funeral of the late Pope Francis, an influential figure, arguably one of the most influential icons of the century. Very unconventional in his approach as well. Even in death, continues to unite world leaders. We can see about 50 of them have been confirmed. They will be attending that. Bishops, cardinals, and other religious figures are going to come out to pay their respects. Also about 200,000 people. We're obviously seeing, the funeral plans being dictated by the Roman Pontiff, and also the dictates as per the shepherd of the Lord's whole flock. That is definitely going to guide what is said to come about. So we're looking at his life, we're looking at his times, the influence that he's had. Speaking about being unconventional, Pope Francis, appointed more women in positions of authority in the Vatican, perhaps more so than any of his predecessors. And so as we continue to celebrate his life and times, the causes he stood for, an advocate for social justice, we're also going to be looking at some of the challenges that he would have faced, and perhaps also what else we can expect. So we also know, as I just alluded to, thousands of people expected to be attending the funeral of Pope Francis, Roman Catholic Church leaders' funeral that is happening later this morning. He was born Jorge Bergoglio in Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires. This was on December 17th, 1936, became the first Latin American Pope in 2013. And throughout his leadership, he was regarded as the Pope of Peace by over 1 billion Catholic Church believers around the world. His opinions and his views on quite a number of issues also created a shift in the Church's historic traditions. And so as we reflect on these life and times, we're going to be chatting more about Pope Francis' life and legacy. For this, we're joined in studio this morning by Father Martin Badenhorst, Order of Preachers, as well as SABC News International Editor Sophie Mukwena. Good morning to the both of you. Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We're seeing live visuals on our screens, Catholics and non-religious citizens coming out to pay their last respects. It's a momentous occasion. We're bidding farewell to one of the most influential leaders. Father Martin, let me start with you, reflecting on his life and times, his legacy. Tell us a little bit more about what that legacy encompassed.
Well, there are two things that stand out about the Holy Father's ministry for me, and that is that he lived up to one of the titles that attached to the papacy, that of Pontifex Maximus, which is the great bridge builder. So not only building a bridge between the spirituality of people and their encounter with God, but also building bridges between people. And that leads to his role as a shepherd. Because if we look at Scripture, then the shepherd actually has 5 duties. And that's in the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, and Jesus lives up to that in the most perfect way. But the shepherd's role is to heal the sick, to bind up the wounded, to strengthen the weak, to seek out the lost, and to bring back the strayed. And I think in all those aspects, you see how Pope Francis poured himself into that role of the shepherd, and how that has influenced the world, so that people of every faith and no faith at all felt a connection with the man who built a bridge to them.
Yes. Yeah. Sophie, just before I bring you in, I want to perhaps also backtrack a little bit, look at his earlier life. I mean, what would that have encompassed? What was that journey like before taking up the reins as Pope?
Well, he was a religious, like I am, living a vowed life within a community. He belonged to the Society of Jesus. He was a Jesuit. And in that, there's a certain strength and belonging to community, which he also lived out in his life, living in Santa Marta, amongst people who were coming in and out of Rome, eating with the folk there, building those relationships. But also he lived through a very difficult political time in Argentina as a leader of the Jesuits, and we know he made mistakes in terms of his governance, in terms of protecting some of the men that were standing up against the government, and how he tried to build bridges there and it didn't quite work. Some of the Jesuit brethren suffered as a result of his actions. But once again, he built bridges afterwards with them and reconciled with them. So that experience of hardship, of encountering political situations that demanded a response, all of that formed him, as well as being the child of migrants.
Yes.
And that, yes, formed his vision and formed his solidarity with people on the edge.
Yes.
And that's a great mark of his papacy as well, that solidarity with people on the edge.
Yes. Sophie, perhaps on the back of what Father Martin's echoed, we're looking at, how it's been said, even in death, he's been able to unite the world once again, world leaders that are set to descend, even just some of those social justice issues that he advocated for, unapologetically so. Talk to us about what came through during his legacy.
The way he conducted himself, clearly it was based on the life experience, as we've just heard, in terms of what happened in Argentina, where he was born, and looking at the family around him, the kind of life he lived from an early age, in terms of being very caring, but also committed to lead by example and to live by example. Because when you look at his background, he used to do things for himself. He wouldn't expect to be served, but he preferred to serve. And that became a hallmark of his entire leadership in terms of religious leadership or spiritual leadership, and as a leader of the church lately. And you would recall that he was very vocal when there were issues around the globe. And again, you can see that it was based on the life experience in terms of his interventions in Argentina, where he erred but was quick to correct those mistakes, because all of us, we are human. And he became a reformist. He became an inclusive person. He became a person who understood that at times you will have to provide leadership, but doing that in a very humility way, not imposing himself as a leader. I recall going to Uganda when he visited the continent in 2013, and you could see how he interacted with people, with the Ugandans, during that East Africa trip in Kenya, where he interacted with the then president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, and William Ruto, who was facing the cases at the International Criminal Court. He also spoke to the leadership of South Sudan. As you know, that South Sudan is part of the East Africa community, and kneeling down, and that was an indication, trying to say to them, be human, talk to one another, unite, stop the fighting and the conflict, kneeling down. Those visuals today, people are looking back, what was the symbol of that act? It was to say, as a leader, be human, and humility can take you far. So he was that kind of a leader. When there were issues of migrants, he was quick, and refugees, to talk about it, because he had experiences in terms of that. And that is why even in recent time, he was very worried about what was happening in the United States of America, asking the leadership of the church in America to speak out on issues that borders on human rights, on discrimination and exclusion. And finally, the peace. It has been something that he fought for in terms of the words. And up to the last day, the last message to world leaders, peace in Palestine, peace in DRC, peace in Sudan, peace in Ukraine. And therefore, the question is, those leaders who will be at the Vatican today, are they there for photo op to be seen, or they will look back at what he said, his last words? Because most of those leaders who are currently involved in these stands-off, some of them will be at the Vatican.
Yes. Father Martin, let's pick up following what Sophie Mokoena just echoed there. What was his relationship like to the continent? We're looking at cultural contexts in relation to the Vatican, that evolution as well. What have you observed over the years? How are you going to remember him?
Yes, so Sophie said one of his primary trips, the very first trip, was to the Central African Republic, which was in a very war-torn state at that moment, and I know it caused a great security upheaval that he wanted to visit there and that he visited there. So the African continent and the concerns of the African continent were very close to his heart. And we will remember him as a friend of the people of Africa, somebody who really reached out to understand the African context, also his own South American context, South speaking to South, was a great hallmark of his relationships throughout the world. He had this concern for the South and appointed cardinals from the South from places that had never had cardinals before, in Africa and in Asia, Oceania. So that outreach to Africa, also in terms of his administration with the rites of the church, he brought back into use what we call the Zairian rite, which is a very enculturated form of our worship in that context.
Father Martin, whilst we're on that, we're going to continue our rolling coverage.